of Natchez the morning they found the rope. Thick, frayed, and stained with something that had darkened to a tar brown overnight. It hung from the rafters of an abandoned mule shed on the edge of the Wilkinson property, twisting like a living thing each time the wind nudged its loosened fibers. Folks in town later said the rope wasn't what unsettled them. Ropes were common enough, especially on land that once held coffles of chained people. But the way it had been arranged, not tied for labor, not knotted for hauling, it hung the way a warning might hang, the way a message might wait for someone to decode it. Sheriff Henry Lark found it first. He moved with a hesitant reverence that morning, lantern raised, boots leaving shallow impressions in the soft mud. What kind of hand would do a thing like this? He muttered, though no one was near enough to answer. Beneath the rope, in a patch of disturbed straw, he discovered prints, huge, elongated, unmistakably human footprints, as if two people had stood there side by side, and yet the impressions were broader, deeper, heavier than any he had ever seen. The prints led out the back of the shed toward the tree line, where they vanished into the blind shadows. That was the morning rumors began to swell. The stories of two giant women escaped from bondage on a plantation upriver, hiding somewhere in the wilderness, and the farmer who had dared shelter them. By sundown, slave hunters rode through the valley carrying a folded piece of paper they refused to let anyone else see. Some said it held a reward. Others whispered it contained an offer more disturbing than silver or gold. Before we continue with the story of the Wilkinson farm and the sisters who fled into the pines, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. In the spring of 1844, the Mississippi frontier hummed with competing voices. Hooves on packed clay roads, steamboat whistles from the river, the clatter of blacksmiths shaping new iron for a territory that believed growth demanded muscle and suffering in equal measure. Natchez itself glittered with wealth built on cotton. Grand houses rose like carved monuments to ambition, their columns reflecting the sunlight, their interiors heavy with imported fabrics and polished walnut furniture. But just beyond these proud facades stretched fields worked by enslaved hands, where the air smelled of soil, sweat, and the relentless churn of industry. The Wilkinson farm was small compared to the sprawling plantations nearby. Its owner, Elijah Wilkinson, tilled the land himself, guiding two aging mules through rows of corn and sorghum. His farm sat at the meeting point of cultivated land and untamed forest. At night, the owls and wolves sang louder than any church bell in Natchez. Elijah, a widower, lived simply, his cabin walls lined with hand-cut lumber, his hearth always flickering with low flames fed by pine knots. The times were tense across the South. Rumors of uprisings, runaways, and abolitionist pamphlets drifting downriver made slaveholders tighten their patrols. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was still in full effect, empowering hunters to track escaped people across state lines. Newspapers printed wanted notices beside advertisements for sugar barrels and prayer books. On Sundays, preachers thundered from their pulpits that obedience was ordained, while in the quarters behind plantation houses, hymns whispered of deliverance and escape. Travelers along the Natchez Trace often spoke of the uneasy silence that followed them through the forests. Bandits haunted the trails. So did patrollers. More than one rider had claimed to see strange shapes in the fog, figures taller than any man, silhouettes vanishing behind cypress trunks. But these were dismissed as tricks of moonlight or the stories of whiskey-tired minds. Still, the land held secrets. The soil remembered things people wished it didn't. Elijah's nearest neighbors were the Turners, a family known for their strict discipline and rigid devotion to order. Their old matriarch, Martha Turner, had once said at supper, "Chaos breeds sin, and sin breeds terror. Mark me, something wicked grows where rules are broken." Her words, half warning and half prophecy, would come to echo through the valley in the months that followed. South of the Wilkinson farm, two enormous slave auctions dominated the region: Forks of the Road in Natchez and the Orleans market downriver. Traders there whispered about the rising prices for special stock, enslaved people of unusual height or strength. Buyers claimed such individuals could do the work of three in the fields. Sellers boasted of giants brought from far plantations, their size treated as a commodity, their humanity ignored like dust under boots. Into this cruel machinery of commerce and cruelty slipped a rumor, quiet at first, carried by steamboat deckhands and night travelers. Two enslaved sisters, sold twice in a single month for their immense stature and formidable strength, had escaped during a thunderstorm upriver. Some said they were over 6.5 feet tall, with arms that could fell small trees. Others claimed they carried the scars of punishments no human should endure. But the most unsettling whisper of all was that wherever these sisters passed, dogs refused to track them, and hunters claimed their bloodhounds lost their voices. In that charged atmosphere, Elijah's farm rested like a fragile island. His fields were green with spring growth, but the winds carried the tension of the broader world. Whispers from the markets, sermons from the pulpits, orders barked by patrollers. Even the birds seemed to sing with one ear turned toward distant hoofbeats. When the two sisters finally slipped into the dark woods bordering Elijah's land, they entered a world already bracing for a storm. And within a single night, a poor farmer's act of mercy would place him in the crosshairs of men who saw compassion as a crime and flesh as property to reclaim or destroy. The air along the lower Mississippi carried a strange heaviness in 1844, the kind that made even daytime feel dimmed at the edges. Though Elijah Wilkinson's farm sat far from the grand avenues of Natchez, the world beyond his modest fields was changing in ways that pressed closer each season. River towns boomed, rail lines crept inward from the east, and the cotton economy tightened its grip on every soul, free or enslaved, in the region. The river itself was the true ruler. Each day, steamboats groaned upriver like floating factories, their black smoke curling into the hazy sky. Their whistles echoed across the water, carrying news, rumors, and fear. Travelers disembarking at Natchez wrote in their journals that the city felt split in halves, one half dazzling with wealth, the other trembling beneath the weight of brutality. On the bluffs, merchant houses glittered with chandeliers and imported wine. Down in the lowlands, the Forks of the Road market filled its pens with chained bodies, men, women, and children driven like cattle through an industry so large and ruthless that even visiting Europeans remarked on its efficiency with a shudder. Public talk of runaways had swollen to a near obsession. Word traveled faster than a galloping horse when an enslaved person escaped. Entire patrols formed in hours. Militiamen boasted they could hear the sound of rebellion in the wind. And every time a new group of runaways was rumored to be hiding in the forests or moving through the ravines at night, preachers thundered louder, plantation owners drank heavier, and ordinary farmers locked their doors. Those forests, the great cypress stands, the stretches of loblolly pine, the winding Yazoo and Natchez trails, held their own reputation. Old Choctaw stories still clung to the land, whispered by elders who remembered how sacred and haunted those woods once were. They spoke of spirits dwelling between the roots, guardians who punished cruelty and protected the desperate. White settlers dismissed these tales in daylight, but no one walked the woods alone after dusk, not even armed men. Distant thunder often rolled across the flatlands without any storm to produce it. Locals said it was the earth settling, though some swore it was something else. Perhaps the echoes of distant hooves, or the groan of ancient trees bending under unseen weight. Travelers who followed the trace at night described strange silhouettes moving between the trunks, figures that looked almost human, but too tall, too broad, vanishing before a lantern could catch them. Most chalked it up to drink or fatigue. But at least a few whispered that giants roamed the woods, not beings of myth, but people driven beyond the limits of human endurance and transformed by suffering. The slave patrols, meanwhile, had grown more ruthless than they had been even a decade before. New laws allowed patrollers to search any property for suspected fugitives, and failure to report runaways could result in heavy fines or public retribution. A man like Elijah, quiet, solitary, and known for a stubborn moral streak, was already an anomaly in a region that prized conformity and obedience to custom. The Turners, his closest neighbors, watched him with hard eyes when he bowed his head silently in church instead of answering Amen after sermons about obedience. Some said he'd grown strange since his wife's death. That grief had cracked his sense of caution. Others muttered that anyone who kept to himself that much was hiding something. A subtle fear hummed through every household. Many families slept with pistols under their pillows. Children were taught to never wander out of sight. Misgivings seeped into daily routines. Doors bolted early, dogs trained to bark at any rustle. Even the plantation owners, with their illusion of total control, sensed the edges of their dominion fraying. Overseers spoke in low tones about slaves whispering at night. They punished imaginary conspiracies before they could take shape, each lash fueled not by fact, but by paranoia. Church bells tried to hold the world together. Their ringing on Sunday mornings called people to wooden pews where they prayed for order, stability, and control. Yet, the hymns often sounded hollow beneath the weight of reality. Parishioners walked home afterward in uneasy silence, clutching their children close. Meanwhile, the land continued its timeless routine. River reeds swayed, insects hummed, and somewhere beneath the droning cicadas, whispers of the escaped sisters began to drift along trading routes and between cabin doors. They weren't like other runaways, people said. Not mere field hands fleeing the whip. These two were taller than any men in the county, stronger than any hunter, born somewhere along the Carolina coast, sold westward, then sold again. Some claimed storm clouds gathered wherever they ran. Others insisted they were blessed, protected by spirits who defied the chains of men. Most dismissed these rumors at first, but after that night, the night they crossed into Elijah Wilkinson's woods, those whispers began to sound less like stories and more like omens, because the men who followed them into Mississippi were not ordinary hunters. They carried weapons too heavy for simple tracking, and they rode not for reward, but for a purpose no one dared speak aloud. And as the sisters moved silently through the dense undergrowth, their breath ragged, their feet raw and bleeding, the land itself seemed to shift around them, as if it recognized their suffering, as if it intended to hide them, for a price. Elijah Wilkinson had the look of a man carved from the very timber he worked with, lean, steady-eyed, and weathered by a life that demanded more endurance than ambition. His beard grew in uneven strokes of gray and umber, and his hands bore the ridges of decades spent gripping plow handles and axe hafts. In the dim morning light, his silhouette often looked like a statue someone had forgotten to finish smoothing, all edges and stubborn lines. He lived alone, not because he preferred solitude, but because loss had hollowed the inside of his world. His wife, Ruth, had died 4 winters earlier from a fever that swept through the valley. Her passing had carved a quiet canyon inside him, one he never spoke of, but everyone could see in the way he paused when he walked past her old shawl folded on the cabin chair. Elijah prayed rarely now, though he still bowed his head when others did. To him, God seemed distant, perhaps not cruel, but inattentive, like a landlord who had locked the door and walked off. "Morning's colder than it ought to be," he once murmured to his mule as he cinched its harness. The mule flicked an ear. "Elijah, you talk to those creatures more than to living folk," neighbor Martha Turner scolded him one afternoon. He simply shrugged. "Creatures don't judge, they just listen." Still, Beneath his quiet exterior lay a stubborn kernel of principle, an instinct to act when a person was suffering, no matter the risk. He'd once dragged a stranger's wagon from a ditch during a storm, earning him a week of rumors about whether he'd lost his sense. But Elijah didn't care. "A man's life ain't a ledger," he said once. "You help where you can." Those words, spoken offhand, would later be repeated in courtrooms and whispered in secret meetings, long after the events on his farm shattered the valley's silence. The escaped sisters entered his life, not as figures of legend, but as faint shapes trembling in the tree line at dusk. Their names were Sariah and Naomi, though Elijah wouldn't learn that for days. At first glance they appeared impossibly tall, shadows rising from the undergrowth like young oaks torn loose by wind. Their bodies bore fresh wounds and clothing that hung in ragged strips. But even in that brokenness, there was something regal in their bearing, an unmistakable pride etched deep into their bones. Sariah the elder stood nearly a head taller than her sister. Her shoulders were broad, her jaw square, and her eyes carried a stillness that made people lower their voices instinctively. She had once been called Cypress, the way enslavers sometimes gave nicknames that stripped people of ancestry but revealed accidental truths. Though she had been bound, traded, beaten, and displayed for her size, her spirit had not bowed. When she spoke, her voice was low and resonant, like a hymn sung in the bones rather than the throat. "We keep moving," Sariah told her sister as they crouched behind a fallen log. Naomi, shuddering, whispered, "They'll find us. You know they will." "They'll try," Sariah answered, "but we're not theirs anymore." She carried fears she never admitted aloud. The sound of male laughter sent her back into memories she labored to bury. The crack of a whip in the distance could freeze her breath. Yet her greatest terror was failing to protect Naomi, a fear that drove her to near madness through their escape. Naomi, younger by 2 years, had a softer face but the same towering height and strength. Her feet were blistered from days of running. She clutched a torn strip of cloth, once part of their mother's head wrap, as if it were a relic capable of steering fate. Unlike her sister, Naomi had a tenderness that the horrors of bondage had not managed to kill. She wept in silence when animals were injured. She prayed even when no God seemed to answer. "Elijah won't turn us away," she whispered the night they approached the farm. "You don't know that," Sariah replied. "I know kindness when I see it." And she had seen it once, before it was beaten out of her world. She believed stubbornly that some trace of it still lived among certain white folk, even if the rest treated her existence as a ledger entry. Together the two sisters carried stories that would later rise to the level of folklore, tales of how they had lifted a man who tried to chain them, how they survived 2 nights in swamplands thick with cottonmouths, how they walked through a lightning storm without flinching. But those were stories whispered by others. Their reality was simpler. They wanted freedom, breath, and the chance to live a life without screams waking them in the night. Following behind them, though still miles away when they reached Elijah's land, rode the man who called himself Reddick Hayes. He led the hunters that would soon menace the valley, but few knew his true history. He was a broad-chested brute with a scar that cut from his ear to his collarbone, said to be a souvenir from a fight with a runaway years earlier. Hayes never confirmed the tale. He merely chuckled when asked, a sound too cold to be amusement. He wore a coat of thick wool even in warm weather, and carried a modified rifle that could fire heavier rounds than any standard weapon. His reputation was built not on efficiency but on brutality. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried a chilling composure. "You track them like shadows," he instructed his men as they mounted at dawn. One hunter asked, "And if they've got help?" Hayes looked toward the Mississippi horizon. "Then God help the helper." His men feared him more than they feared any runaway. Some whispered that Hayes didn't chase fugitives for reward money, but for pleasure. Others believed he was enforcing orders from a wealthy plantation owner with political power beyond the region. Whatever the truth, Hayes never failed to reclaim or kill his quarry. 3 lives: Elijah the widowed farmer, Sariah and Naomi the escaped sisters, and Hayes the relentless hunter, would soon converge on a single night that would stain the Wilkinson land forever. And every person involved would emerge marked in ways the county's records would never fully capture. It began with sounds Elijah couldn't explain. Soft at first, so soft he wondered if grief had finally begun to invent noises in the empty corners of his life. On the night the sisters hid in his barn, the wind was still. The moon hung low and red, a swollen ember pressed into the horizon. Elijah had been mending a cracked lantern glass at his table when he heard it, a dull, rhythmic thud coming from the old corn crib behind the cabin. Not footsteps, heavier, as though something immense was leaning its weight into the earth itself. He stood, hand hovering over the rifle mounted near the door, listening. Another thud, then a soft, strangled gasp. Human, unmistakably. When he stepped outside, the night greeted him with that strange dying moon glow that makes every shape look distorted. The fields rustled not with wind, but with breath, as if something hidden there was struggling to remain silent. "Who's out there?" he called. His voice barely carried. "Show yourself." For a moment, nothing. Only the cicadas. Only the beating of Elijah's heart. But then, from the shadows between the corn crib and the small tool shed, came a whisper, fragile, quivering, unmistakably female. "Please, don't shoot." As Elijah approached, lantern raised, 2 enormous shapes pulled themselves tighter into the darkness, their forms hunched low, trembling, trying to make themselves smaller, though such a thing was nearly impossible. He recognized at once that these were no threats, just 2 terrified souls at the edge of collapse. But something else was there too, a sensation he couldn't name. Not danger exactly, not evil, more like the charged hush before a storm breaks. Sariah stared at him through eyes that glimmered more with fierce warning than fear, while Naomi clutched her sister's arm as though Elijah might dissolve it into smoke at any moment. "We mean you no harm," Sariah said. Her voice, though weak, carried a strange resonance, like a bell struck miles away. Elijah lowered his rifle. "Are you hurt?" Naomi answered, barely audible. "They're coming." In the hours that followed, Elijah learned fragments of their escape, just enough to feel the weight of danger pressing against the walls of his cabin. He gave them water first, then tore strips from an old cotton sheet to wrap Naomi's wounded feet. Sariah refused bandages, insisting her skin would heal on its own. Elijah didn't push her, though he noticed the deep, rope-like welts along her wrists. New wounds crossed over old ones. Someone had chained her with cruelty, and not for the first time. Yet, even as exhaustion dragged them toward sleep, both women jolted awake at the smallest creak or sigh of the house. "They'll use dogs," Naomi whispered. "Big ones." Sariah shook her head sharply. "Dogs won't follow us. They never do now." Elijah frowned. "Why not?" A long silence followed, broken only by Naomi's shuddering breath. Sariah finally said, "Because something changed that night on the river." She wouldn't say more. By dawn, the atmosphere around the cabin felt charged. The birdsong struck Elijah as oddly muted, as though the creatures sensed what the humans could not. Mist clung low to the earth, refusing to lift, and the mule balked at approaching the barn, snorting and stamping until Elijah led it away. Even the air carried a metallic scent, rain without clouds. At noon, Martha Turner passed by on the road with her grandson in their wagon. She pulled the rein sharply when she spotted Elijah. "Something wrong on your land?" she called. "Been hearing strange noises all morning, like trees groaning, but the wind ain't moving." Elijah stiffened. Just an old mule acting up. Martha's sharp eyes narrowed. You look pale. You ill? Just tired. She hesitated, then said quietly, Storm's coming. I feel it in my bones. Yet the sky above them was perfectly clear. That afternoon, an odd rumor began circulating through the valley. A hunter's dog, one trained specifically for tracking runaways, had turned on its own master that morning, biting his hand before fleeing into the forest. Another pack refused to take a scent from a scrap of cloth said to belong to one of the escaped sisters. The animals whined, trembled, and backed away as though the cloth were aflame. By evening, people claimed to hear low, distant moans drifting from the forest, carried by no wind at all. Some swore they heard branches cracking under enormous weight. Others whispered that two towering women had been seen near the riverbank, moving without leaving footprints. The most frightened of all were the men preparing for the hunt. At a tavern near the road, Elijah overheard a conversation carried by nervous, hushed tones. You seen the prints? One man whispered. Ain't natural, too big, too deep. His companion spat tobacco. Just big women, that's all. You ever seen women that size? No. What if they ain't? Hush that now. Hayes will hear. Hayes. The name clung to the walls like rot. Back at Elijah's farm, the sisters sat by the hearth, their immense forms hunched in an attempt to appear smaller. Naomi stared into the flames with eyes full of dread. Sariah rarely blinked, listening for something only she could detect. At one point, Elijah asked softly, What happened to you on the river? What changed? Sariah looked at him, not with suspicion now, but with a deep, weary sorrow. Some spirits answer only when suffering grows too great, she whispered. We begged for strength, and something hurt us. Whatever it was did not come gently. Naomi shivered. Sometimes I think it still walks with us. Elijah's lantern flickered then, though the air remained still. A low groan rose from somewhere outside, wood bending under unseen pressure. Sariah stood slowly. They've entered the valley, she murmured. How do you know? Elijah asked. Because the world goes quiet when men like them approach. And indeed, the silence outside had deepened into something unnatural, thick, expectant, waiting. The hunt had begun. They found the bones first, and then the rope. It was the spring of 1872 when a pair of boys went poking around the far edge of the old Wilkinson place, looking for arrowheads. The farm had been abandoned for years by then, left to rot in the wet Mississippi air. Vines strangled the fence posts. The cabin sagged like an old man collapsing into himself. Folks in town said the land was cursed, and they had a list of reasons long enough to match any sermon. But boys don't believe in curses, not until they stumble right into one. The smaller of the two, Jonah Pike, spotted something pale jutting from a collapsed wall of the mule shed. At first he thought it was a root, or maybe a chunk of old whitewashed board, but when he reached for it, his fingers closed around something smooth and hard and curved. He yanked it free. A human jawbone, still holding 3 yellow teeth that looked ready to whisper secrets. "Sam," he breathed, "come look." They pulled at the boards, sending dust and splinters into the light. Behind the wall, half buried in old straw and earth, lay the remnants of a shallow pit. Bones, mixed and scattered. A long femur, ribs like broken ivory fingers. A fragment of a skull with a cracked temple. Some were small, almost delicate. Others were massive, far larger than any man Jonah had ever seen. Above the pit, hanging from a rafter beam blackened by time, was a rope. It was unnaturally thick, braided in a way neither boy recognized, as if several ropes had been twisted together into one obscene cord. The noose at the end had been cut open, its fibers splayed like a mutilated flower. Stains had soaked into the hemp, brown, hardened, stubborn against the years of rain and dust. "Put that down," came a voice from the doorway. Sheriff Matthew Caro stood there, older now, belly gone soft over his belt, but his eyes still sharp as nails. He'd come out that day because a passing peddler had mentioned seeing smoke from the old chimney at night, swearing someone was living on the cursed land again. Caro hadn't expected to find boys. He certainly hadn't expected to find the rope. He stepped closer, slow, as if the air around the mule shed were thicker than elsewhere. His boots crunched on bone. "Back away," he said quietly. "Don't touch anything else." Jonah swallowed. "Sheriff, what is this?" Caro stared at the rope, at the hacked-open noose, at the impossible bones below. His jaw muscles worked as if he were chewing on something bitter. His mind went back nearly 30 years to the spring of 1844, to the days when the Wilkinson farm still breathed smoke from its chimney and two strangers with shoulders as wide as doors walked like hunted shadows among the pines. "Some debts," the sheriff finally said, his voice low. "Take a long time to rise back up." Later that evening, behind closed doors, older folks in Natchez would whisper that the sheriff had gone pale as a sheet when he saw that rope. That he recognized it. That he'd seen it once before, in the hands of men who rode under a private banner, men hired to do the work others were too respectable to do themselves. They'd whisper that what killed the Wilkinson farm was not drought, nor blight, nor misfortune, but something much darker. That it all began when a poor farmer offered shelter to two towering sisters who had run from bondage, and the slave hunters who followed them arrived with an offer that turned mercy into a crime. Before we continue with the story of Elijah Wilkinson, the escaped sisters, and the night the hunters came with their shocking bargain, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. By the time those bones were found, the world along the lower Mississippi had changed. The war had come and gone. Chains had been struck from wrists and ankles, at least in the eyes of the law, and the great plantations were no longer the unshakable kingdoms that they once were. But to understand what happened on the Wilkinson land, you have to go back to when the rope was still new, the noose still whole, and human beings could be bought and sold under the bright noon sun. It was the spring of 1844, when Mississippi was young and cruel and loud. The river ruled everything. The Mississippi flowed heavy and brown past Natchez, carrying steamboats loaded with cotton bales, chained people, barrels of sugar, and the latest news from New Orleans and points east. Each whistle blast echoed along the bluffs, a shrill announcement of fortunes being made and lives being traded. On the high ground, the town of Natchez was a glittering little empire. White-columned mansions with manicured gardens, parlors fragrant with tobacco smoke and French perfume, chandeliers cutting bright shapes into polished floors. On market days, you could walk down Main Street and hear 3 languages at once: English, French, and the low murmur of enslaved people speaking to each other in dialects their owners never bothered to learn. Ladies in wide skirts glided past storefronts stacked with bolts of cloth and imported tea, while merchants stood in doorways shouting prices for fertilizer, tools, and gunpowder. A man could buy a Bible and a branding iron on the same corner. But below that glittering surface lay a rougher world. Just outside town stood one of the most notorious slave markets in the region, Forks of the Road. People called it that because 2 main roads joined there, and anything that needed to move north or south passed its gates. Wagons, drovers, and coffles of chained men, women, and children forced to march in line. The smell there was unforgettable. Sweat, fear, unwashed bodies, tobacco spit, and the metallic tang of iron chains. Traders barked out descriptions of the people they were selling, their voices oily with pride. "Strong buck, no whip scars. Good breeder, healthy teeth. Field gal near 6 foot can lift 2 bales alone. Some months, rumors circled about unusual stock. This planter had sent a woman so tall she could look a grown man in the eye without lifting her chin. That buyer had acquired a pair of brothers rumored to be strong enough to bend iron bars. The richer the planter, the more he liked having something to show off at gatherings. Human beings became curiosities, talking points between glasses of brandy. It was from these whispered boasts that the first stories of the sisters began to drift. No one in Natchez knew exactly where they'd been born, only that they'd come from farther east. Maybe the Carolinas, maybe Virginia, sold down the line as the Cotton Kingdom swallowed more and more of the frontier. By the time they reached Mississippi soil, they were talked about not as women, but as investments. Giants, some traders said, lowering their voices as if that made it more respectable. Worth 3 ordinary hands each, strong as oxen. Whatever price they fetched, it was enough to make powerful men pay attention. Beyond the markets and mansions, the countryside rolled out in a patchwork of fields, swamps, and deep, whispering woods. Huge plantations stretched along the river, their white houses gleaming like teeth against the dark soil. Between them, smaller farms clung to the edges of clearings and creek beds, tilled by men who owned no one but their own kin, and carried a quiet resentment for the grand planters who ruled county politics. Elijah Wilkinson's place was one of those small farms. His land lay a day's ride from Natchez, toward the low hills where the forest pressed close and the roads turned to rutted clay after a rain. His cabin stood at the edge of a clearing he'd hacked from the trees himself, a simple rectangle of pine planks with a stone chimney at one end. Chickens scratched in the dirt yard. 2 mules, old and stubborn, pulled his plow and hauled his corn. A narrow creek slipped along the back of his property, murky and slow, feeding into a larger bayou farther south. In summer, the heat there could suffocate a man. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth, hog pens, and flowering vines. Cicadas shrieked so loud they seemed to drill into the skull. At night, frogs and nightbirds took over, calling back and forth across the dark. In winter, the wind tore through the bare trees like a warning, rattling loose shutters and sending people hurrying to latch doors and bank fires. The land was beautiful, but cruel. Floods came without warning, wiping out rows of young corn. Insects devoured what the weather spared. Fever moved through the lowlands some years, felling both white and black, slave and free, with equal indifference. Yet the greatest tension came not from the sky or the soil, but from the way people treated each other. This was a time when a white man's worth in the county depended on how loudly he endorsed the system that fed it. To question slavery publicly was to risk being called a traitor, a fanatic, or worse. Men who owned hundreds of enslaved people sat on county councils, funded churches, and controlled local newspapers. Their children grew up believing it was all part of the natural order, as fixed as the river's path. In the pulpit, Baptist and Methodist ministers thundered about obedience and hierarchy. They twisted scripture to say that bondage was a burden laid by God, that good masters were shepherds and good servants should be grateful for their protection. On Sunday mornings, the roads filled with buggies and wagons bearing families in their best clothes, Bibles in hand, while enslaved people walked in separate clusters or listened to sermons from the yard, if they were allowed to listen at all. Behind the main towns and big houses, in shadowed quarters and hidden clearings, a different spiritual life thrived. Enslaved men and women met secretly at night to sing hymns about a God who freed captives, a Jesus who sided with the oppressed. They whispered older stories too, tales carried from Africa, merged with native and Christian beliefs, about spirits in the trees, guardians in the swamps, and the dead who refused to rest. It was among those hidden gatherings that the most chilling rumors about the sisters took shape. Some said the overseers who'd whipped them up the river grew sick afterward. Terrible kinds of sick, the kind that rotted a man from the inside. Others claimed bloodhounds sent after them one night refused to cross a certain line in the dirt, whining and trembling as if facing a fire no one else could see. A few whispered that the sisters had cried out to God during a storm, and something had answered, not with words, but with a strength that made wood splinter and iron bend. Most white folks dismissed such stories as superstitious nonsense, but they heard them all the same, and sometimes, alone in the dark, they remembered them. By 1844, fear of rebellion lay over the region like a greasy film. Tales of past uprisings, real and imagined, were told over and over. In Virginia, in Louisiana, men had taken up arms or poisoned wells or simply refused to obey. Newspapers exaggerated, but the effect was the same. Planters lay awake at night wondering if the people in their quarters were whispering about more than the day's labor. Into this atmosphere rode men like Reddick Hayes. Slave hunters, they called themselves. Agents, sometimes, if they wanted to sound respectable. They traveled on horseback with packs of trained dogs, iron leg shackles hanging from their saddles, and warrants folded in their coat pockets. The law of the land gave them wide power. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 said any black person suspected of escape could be seized and returned. Proof was loose. Justice was looser. If a poor farmer turned away a hunter, he risked fines. If he was suspected of hiding a fugitive, he risked worse. And yet, now and then, a man or woman would take that risk anyway. Something in them would rebel against the sight of chains, the sound of a whip, the look in a runaway's eyes. Elijah Wilkinson was such a man. People in the valley saw him as peculiar but not dangerous. He was not a loud talker. In church, he sat near the back, head bowed but eyes open, as if listening more to the room than to the preacher. He had once owned a single enslaved man, years before, and then quietly sold him his freedom, an odd act that nobody fully understood and which Elijah never explained. Since then, he worked his land alone. "He's got too much conscience for his own good," Martha Turner, his nearest neighbor, would say at the supper table. "That kind of thing gets you in trouble." Her eldest son would shrug. "Man's just soft-hearted." Martha would press her lips tight. In times like these, soft hearts get crushed. There were other pressures in the region too, political ones that most farmers barely understood. Men in Natchez talked about tariffs and states' rights, and abolitionists up north plotting to topple their entire way of life. They spoke of outside agitators sending pamphlets downriver, stirring up unrest. In private, they formed committees. In public, they hosted balls. At the forks of the road, they bought more people. And somewhere above all this, in houses with finer curtains and thicker walls than anyone else's, the truly powerful made their calculations. For them, the sisters were not just runaway slaves. They were property of unusual value. A pair of giants, twice sold, much discussed, gone missing. To lose them was to lose money, to lose face, to invite mockery from rivals. Those men did not send out just any patrol. They hired specialists. So when the rumor finally reached Natchez that two towering women had slipped off a plantation upriver during a thunderstorm and headed south under cover of night, the whispers did not stay in the slave quarters and taverns. They climbed into parlors. They settled in church pews. They reached the ears of men whose names never appeared in the newspapers, and those men reached for their purses. By the time the sisters crossed into the woods near Elijah Wilkinson's farm, their existence had become a kind of shadow legend. Some said they were wicked, unnatural creatures. Some said they were blessed by God or guarded by spirits. Some said they didn't exist at all. But the men who paid for their capture knew they were real. They had the bill of sale to prove it. And when they rode out with Reddick Hayes at their head, they carried not only iron and rope, but something folded carefully in Hayes's coat pocket. A piece of paper that would arrive on Elijah's table the day after he chose to offer two strangers water and shelter. An offer written in cold, precise ink. An offer that would chill him more than any gun barrel. The first sign came just before dawn, when the forest should have been alive with birdsong, but instead lay wrapped in an unnatural stillness. Elijah noticed it as he stepped out onto his porch with a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. A quiet like that didn't belong in Mississippi. Not in spring, not with the trees leafed out and the river running full. He scanned the tree line. The pines stood motionless, as though something inside the forest held its breath. Then he heard it. A sharp, splitting crack, like a branch being torn clean from its trunk. Elijah froze. The sound hadn't come from the direction of the sisters' hiding place, but deeper in the woods, where the ground dipped into an old creek bed. He waited, coffee forgotten in his hand. Another crack followed, then another, rhythmic, heavy, as if something large was forcing its way through brush thick enough to snag even a deer. He set the cup down and reached for the rifle he kept by the door. Inside the cabin, Naomi stirred awake with a small gasp. Saraya sat upright instantly, eyes narrowed, posture tensed like an animal listening for a predator. "Elijah," she called softly. "Is someone out there?" He didn't answer at first. The cracking had stopped. The silence returned. Thick, eerie, wrong. When he stepped inside, Naomi was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, trembling in the dim light. Saraya had already risen to her full, towering height. "Tracks," Elijah said, "or something making them." Saraya moved to the window, ducking slightly so she wouldn't hit her head on the low beams. Naomi followed, clutching her sister's arm. "2 nights," Naomi whispered. "They've been getting closer." Elijah turned to her. "How do you know?" Naomi shivered. "Because when they're close, I can feel it in my ribs, like they're pulling something behind them." Saraya shot her a warning look, but Elijah didn't miss the fear beneath the unattempted stoicism. He stepped closer to the window himself. The mist was beginning to lift now, revealing darker shapes along the edge of the trees, impressions in the soil, long and deep, boot prints. Several, at least 5 or 6 men, and beside them, something else entirely. A print nearly the length of Elijah's forearm, deep enough to pool with dew. His breath caught. "What in God's name made that?" he whispered. Naomi's voice came faintly. "Not what. Who?" Later that day, the Turner boy, young Caleb, came tearing down the road on horseback, hat flying behind him, face white as flour. "Elijah!" he shouted before he'd even dismounted. "You hear the dogs last night? They were screaming, not barking, screaming." Elijah stiffened. "Screaming how?" "Like they were being torn apart." Behind him, the mule shuddered as though remembering something. Caleb swung down from the saddle, wiping sweat from his brow. "Pa says we're not supposed to go near the creek. Something spooked every animal on that side of our land. Chickens flapping, cattle kicking at shadows all night." Saraya stepped into the doorway then, silent, tall as a nightmare silhouette. Caleb stumbled backward, eyes widening. "She won't harm you," Elijah said quickly. "She's a guest." Caleb swallowed hard. "Guest or not, I'd stay away from the woods if I were you. Pa says hunters rode through at dawn, big men, had iron cages on their wagon, like the kind they use for—" He stopped himself. Saraya's voice, quiet but heavy with warning, finished his sentence for him. "For people." Caleb nodded. "Get home," Elijah told him. "Stay near your family." After the boy had gone, Saraya turned slowly toward Elijah. "They're here," she said. "Hayes and his men. They're combing the valley." "Oh, you sure?" Elijah asked, though the truth was already clear in his gut. Saria nodded once. Hayes doesn't stalk like a man. He stalks like hunger. As if summoned by the word, a low moan drifted across the fields. Not human, not animal either. A long, vibrating sound that made the hairs on Elijah's arms stand upright. Then another, and another. The sisters tensed. Naomi covered her ears and whispered a prayer. "What is that?" Elijah breathed. Sariah's answer chilled him. "The dogs. They've lost the trail again. They're calling for help, or for forgiveness." That night the forest glowed faintly with a strange, shifting light. Bluish, like foxfire, but too bright, too focused. Elijah stood at his window, watching as the glow drifted through the pines, followed by dark figures moving with purpose. He could hear occasional shouts, sharp, angry, frustrated. At one point, a hunter's voice rang clear through the trees. "They ain't natural. No woman leaves prints like this. No one human does." Another voice snapped back. "Shut your mouth before Hayes hears you." A third added, trembling, "I swear I saw eyes in the dark, tall as a horse's head." Sariah stood behind Elijah silently. Naomi clung to her sister's side. "Do not fear them," Sariah murmured to Naomi. "Fear the men who ride with chains." Elijah turned toward her. "What are you not telling me?" Sariah met his gaze, and for the first time there was something in her expression that looked like shame. "Something followed us out of the river," she whispered. "Something that isn't finished with us yet." And in the quiet that followed, Elijah understood. The hunters were dangerous. But something else, something older, hungrier, and unseen, walked with the sisters. And it was getting closer. The moon that rose over the Wilkinson farm that night looked wrong, too bright at the edges, too blurred in the center, as though smudged by a trembling hand. Elijah noticed it first while hauling a bucket of water from the creek. The reflection in the surface rippled like a wounded eye staring back at him. A few frogs croaked, then fell silent, as if scolded by something unseen. Back at the cabin, the sisters sat close to the hearth. The fire cast amber strokes across their skin, illuminating the exhaustion etched into every line of their faces. Naomi's breathing had grown shallow. Sariah held her hand, squeezing gently. "Elijah," Naomi whispered as he entered. "They're nearer now." He set the bucket down. "Are you sure?" Naomi nodded once. "My bones feel pulled, like something's tugging me forward." Sariah frowned at her sister, anger and worry entwined. "You should rest." Naomi looked up. "If I rest, I'll dream. You know what happens when I dream." Elijah didn't ask. He could see from Sariah's expression that some truths were too heavy for speaking. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to Naomi. She accepted with shaking fingers. Outside, a faint tapping echoed. Once, twice, 3 times, like something metallic brushing against tree trunks. Sariah rose to her full height, towering so close to the rafters Elijah feared she'd hit them. Her eyes narrowed. "They've split into 2 groups," she said. "One coming from the ridge, one from the creek." "You can hear them?" Elijah asked. "I don't hear," she replied. "I feel." Naomi whispered, "They've taken their lanterns down to half flame. That means they're hunting quiet." Elijah grabbed his rifle. "You can't stay here. If they find you, they will kill you," Sariah finished. "Or worse." Naomi looked at him with a sorrow that seemed older than her 20-some years. "We didn't mean to bring danger to your door." Elijah shook his head. "You didn't bring danger. It was already coming." A sudden crack split the night, the sharp report of a rifle firing somewhere beyond the creek. Then a scream cut through the darkness. Not a human scream, something shriller, panicked, a dog. The cry rose, then choked into silence. Naomi covered her mouth. "They found something," Elijah whispered. "What could make a dog scream like that?" Sariah didn't answer. Her jaw clenched. She placed a massive hand on Naomi's back and guided her toward the small sleeping room. "Stay here," Elijah told them. "I'll go look." Sariah's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising gentleness, but unbreakable strength. "No," she said. "There are things in those woods no rifle can stop." He swallowed, throat tight. "But if the hunters are hurting your—" "We fear the hunters less than what hunts them now," Sariah murmured. A chill crawled down Elijah's spine. The tapping outside grew louder, closer, more purposeful, like metal dragged slowly over bark. "Elijah," Naomi whispered, "close the shutter." He did, but the moment he latched it, something brushed against it from the outside. A soft scrape, a slow drag, as if a fingernail the size of a knife blade traced the wood. Sariah stiffened. "That isn't Hayes," she said. "And it isn't a man." The tapping stopped. A faraway voice cried out in agony. "Get it off me! Get—" A second voice shouted, "Don't look at its eyes! Don't look!" Gunfire erupted. 3 shots, then 2 more, then frantic scrambling, branches breaking, men cursing, dogs whining. Then silence. Deep, total silence. Naomi trembled violently. "It followed us, all the way here." Elijah wanted to demand answers, but the words stuck inside his dry mouth. Instead, he asked, "What happened on the river? What is it that hunts them?" Naomi opened her mouth, but Sariah cut her off. "It isn't something we can name," she said. "Not without calling it closer." But Elijah pressed. "I need to know. If I'm to help you, I have to understand." Sariah stared into the fire. Its light flickered across her eyes, revealing a depth of pain Elijah had never seen in another human being. "When we fled the plantation," she began slowly, "they sent the dogs first. Big ones, 3 of them. They cornered us near the river. Naomi slipped in the mud. A dog leapt for her throat." Naomi winced at the memory. "I grabbed it," Sariah continued. "I wasn't thinking. I just grabbed, and its bones broke under my hands, too easily." Her voice wavered. Elijah said nothing. "They came after us then, 6 hunters. One struck Naomi with a chain, another tried to bind my wrists. I fought. I don't remember how, just that the lightning was so bright I couldn't see their faces. And then," Elijah whispered. Sariah hesitated. "Then the river rose." Naomi's breath hitched. "It wasn't rain. There was no storm." "The water rose like it had hands," Sariah said. "It lifted 2 of the men and tore them apart." Elijah felt his pulse pound. Sariah stared at him, her voice dropping. "Something in that river answered us. Something old. Something that hates chains." Naomi whispered, "It doesn't follow us because we want it to. It follows because we called it once. And spirits don't forget." A sudden pounding on the door made them all jump. "Elijah!" a voice shouted. "Open up!" Elijah recognized it instantly. Martha Turner. He rushed to the door and cracked it open. Martha stood there with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her face ghost white. "Elijah, is it true?" she gasped. "Hunters are dead in the woods. Caleb saw lanterns swinging by themselves. There's blood on the reeds near our fence." Elijah opened the door wider, ushering her inside. "Martha, calm yourself." But she froze when she saw the sisters. She stared up at Sariah first, eyes wide with awe and terror, then at Naomi, who sat trembling beside the hearth. Martha whispered, "Lord, have mercy?" Sariah straightened, not defiantly, but with dignity. "We mean you no harm," she said. Martha let out a shuddering breath. "I know who you are. Folks have been whispering about 2 giant women on the run, but they didn't speak about whatever else is out there." "No one can speak about it," Naomi murmured. "They don't survive long enough." Martha turned to Elijah, voice trembling. You have to send them away. If the hunters don't kill you, whatever's killing them will." "No," Elijah said firmly. "I won't hand them over." Martha stiffened. "Elijah, this isn't just unlawful. It's suicidal." Sariah stepped forward. "We don't want your deaths, only distance." But before Elijah could answer, another sound echoed from outside, a low, deep moan, like the earth itself groaning. Then footsteps, heavy ones, crushing twigs and pine cones. Martha gasped. "Something's coming!" Naomi whimpered. Elijah grabbed his rifle. Then a voice, cold and cruel, called from the yard. "Elijah Wilkinson, open your door." "Hayes." Sariah stiffened. Naomi hid behind her. Martha pressed a hand to her mouth. Elijah's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Hayes spoke again, tone measured and terrifyingly calm. "We found your footprints, all 3 sets. You've been harboring runaways." Silence. Hayes continued. "I'm prepared to offer you a choice. One no decent man refuses." A pause. Then, "Step outside. Let's talk. Man to man." Elijah looked to the sisters. Naomi clutched Sariah's arm, shaking her head violently. Sariah whispered, "Don't go." But Elijah already knew he would, not because he trusted Hayes, not because he believed in mercy, but because something else, something unseen, moved just behind the hunters. And Elijah feared that whatever it was, stepping outside might be the only way to delay its hunger. He opened the door. The night swallowed him whole. Hayes stood about 15 paces from the porch, framed by the glow of a single lantern resting at his feet. The flame inside guttered strangely, bending toward him instead of upward, as though bowing to its master. Behind him, 4 hunters waited in a ragged semicircle, men with rifles clenched tight and eyes darting at every shifting shadow in the yard. Their dogs were nowhere in sight. The absence was unsettling. Hayes lifted his chin. "Evening, Wilkinson." Elijah stepped onto the packed earth, forcing himself not to look toward the tree line where something unseen crouched in the dark. The night air felt too thick, too warm. It clung to his skin like breath. "State your business," Elijah said. "You know my business," Hayes answered calmly. 2 women, runaways from the Montrose estate upriver, came through here. Their tracks lead to your door." He tilted his head slightly. "Unless your mule's got a talent for walking upright with human strides." Elijah said nothing. Hayes continued, "I'm not here to hang you. Not unless you force me. My employers have something else in mind." One of the hunters behind him shifted nervously. Elijah caught sight of blood smeared along the man's sleeve, fresh, dark, and not all human. The man noticed Elijah looking and quickly hid his hand. Hayes took a step closer. "Wilkinson, you're a poor farmer, widower, land barely worth the taxes you scraped together, but tonight offers you a chance to change that, to walk away from this valley with gold enough to start anew." Elijah didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on Hayes's scarred face. Hayes smiled, thin and humorless. "All you must do is give me something." He paused. "The sisters." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I'm not selling them." Hayes chuckled softly. "I didn't say sell. I said give." The hunters behind him exchanged uneasy looks. Elijah noticed one of them flinching at the slightest rustle of grass. Hayes raised a hand and pointed it calmly toward Elijah's cabin. "There are things I know," he said quietly. "Things about those women that make them worth more than any cattle or cotton brought through this county. And the men who hired me are willing to pay handsomely. They want the sisters alive, mostly unbroken. Their exact words." Elijah felt a surge of anger rise in him. "They're not property." Hayes's smile vanished. "In Mississippi," he said coldly, Everything is property, even the dead, even the sins of men. A branch cracked in the woods, loud, deliberate. Every hunter jumped. Hayes didn't look toward the sound. He kept his gaze locked on Elijah. "You hear that?" he asked softly. "That's why I need the sisters now. Something in those trees has been following us since the river. It's taken 2 of my men already, and a dog that cost more than your farm. Whatever they stirred up during their escape." His voice dropped. "It's hungry, and I think it's growing." Another crack echoed, closer this time. Something dragged through underbrush with a slow, scraping rhythm. The sound sent chills through every man present. Hayes finally turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the dark. "That thing wants them," he murmured. "And the only way to stop it is to take them back where they belong." Elijah scoffed. "You believe taking them back to bondage will stop whatever's stalking your men?" Hayes looked at him sharply. "I don't believe. I know." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Some spirits cling to bloodlines, Wilkinson. Some cling to land. And some cling to the ones who call them from the deep." Elijah felt his heartbeat quicken. What did they call? Hayes's expression flickered. Fear, real fear, surfacing behind his cold exterior. "A river thing," he said. "A spirit older than any church prayer, a watcher of the drowned. It answered their cries during the storm. And now, it follows." The hunters behind him murmured nervously. Hayes lifted his chin. "Give me the sisters. Let me bind them. Let me take them away from this cursed valley, and you'll be paid enough to forget this night ever happened. Enough to move north if you please." Elijah took a slow breath. "And if I refuse?" Hayes leaned forward, voice low and razor-sharp. "Then whatever tears men apart in the pines tonight will find something else to hunt before dawn." His eyes flicked toward the cabin. "And it won't stop with my men." A long silence stretched. Even the air seemed to tremble with anticipation. From the dark woods, a distant howl rose, long, mournful, and not belonging to any dog Elijah had ever heard. One hunter dropped his rifle. Another whispered, "Lord, protect us." Hayes didn't look away from Elijah. "Well?" he asked softly. "Your answer?" Elijah swallowed. He felt sweat trickle down his back, though the night had turned chillingly cold. Inside the cabin, a shadow moved, Naomi watching from behind the shutter. Saraya's outline towered behind her. They were terrified, but what terrified them more was Hayes. Elijah stepped back toward his porch. "My answer," he said quietly, "is no." Hayes's jaw clenched. "We'll force our way in if we must." "No," Elijah repeated, voice harder now. "You won't." For the first time, Hayes looked confused. Elijah lifted his rifle. "Because there's something behind you." Hayes spun. Between the trees, 2 massive, faintly glowing eyes stared back, motionless, unblinking, impossibly high off the ground. The hunters screamed. One fired blindly into the woods. Another tripped over the lantern, sending it clattering across the dirt. Shadows swung wildly as the flame sputtered. Hayes stumbled back, cursing. "Hold your fire! Hold!" A massive shape moved. Not seen, felt, like a wave of darkness shifting against deeper darkness. Then something grabbed the nearest hunter and dragged him into the trees. The man didn't even have time to scream. Hayes shouted, "Back! Form a line! Form!" Another hunter vanished. A third dropped to his knees, sobbing. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't." He was gone a heartbeat later, yanked into the shadows. Hayes fired 3 shots into the blackness, each one swallowed by the night. The woods shuddered with something large, something wet, something breathing. "Elijah!" Martha screamed from inside the cabin. "Get in now!" But Elijah couldn't move. Across the yard, Hayes turned toward him with the expression of a man facing damnation. He whispered, "You doomed us all." The trees erupted. Elijah dove for the door as something massive burst from the forest, slamming into the clearing. The ground shook. Martha screamed. Naomi wailed. Saria roared, "Close the door!" Elijah didn't look back. He slammed the door shut just as Hayes's final shot rang out, then cut short by a gurgling sound that chilled the blood. Inside the cabin, the sisters huddled near the hearth. Martha clutched the table, knuckles white. Outside, something huge dragged across the yard, sniffing, breathing, searching. Naomi whispered, "It wants us." Saria wrapped an arm around her, trembling. "Elijah," Martha gasped. "What do we do?" Elijah lifted his rifle, though his hands shook. "We survive," he said. But deep inside, he feared survival might no longer be an option. The thing outside circled the cabin with slow, deliberate steps, each one sinking deep into the wet earth, vibrating through the floorboards. The fire crackled weakly, as though shrinking from the presence pressing against the walls. Every breath inside the cabin seemed too loud. Naomi clutched Saria's arm. Martha slid down the wall until she sat trembling next to the hearth. Elijah moved quietly to the window, keeping low, rifle in hand. "Don't look out," Saria warned in a whisper rough with dread. "It sees through eyes that aren't its own." But Elijah had to know where it was, had to know whether Hayes was dead or dying, or worse. He lifted the corner of the shutter just an inch. The yard was dimly lit by the dying lantern that lay on its side, flames sputtering. A dark stain stretched near the tree line. Blood. Something larger than a man dragged parallel streaks toward the creek. A hunter's hat lay crushed in the dirt. But no bodies. Elijah lowered the shutter. "It took them," he said softly. "All of them." Martha's eyes widened. "Why? Lord above, why?" Naomi answered in a thin, trembling voice. "Because we called it once." Saria put a hand over her sister's. "Hush." "No," Naomi whispered. "He needs to know." Elijah swallowed. "Know what?" Saria hesitated. The creature outside exhaled, a long, damp breath that crept in through the cracks in the walls. She lowered her voice, speaking as though the thing itself were listening. "There are spirits older than the chains men forged," she said. "Older than the plantations, older than any scripture preached on this land. They live in water, in shadow, in places where suffering seeps into the soil." Naomi continued. "On the river, when they were beating us, when they tried to take Saria, she cried out, not to God, not exactly." Saria's jaw clenched, shame flickering across her face. Martha whispered, horrified, "You pray to something else?" Naomi nodded. "And it answered." Elijah felt the hairs on his neck rise. Saria's voice dropped to a near growl. "We didn't ask it to kill, we asked for strength to fight. But spirits don't understand limits. They answer with their own justice." Another immense step thudded outside. Dust sifted from the rafters. Martha covered her mouth with her shawl to stifle a cry. "What does it want now?" Elijah asked. Naomi looked toward the shutter. "It wants to finish what it started." Another dragging sound moved along the side of the cabin, slow and exploratory, like fingertips tracing wood. The thing paused near the window, sniffing. Elijah clenched his rifle tighter. "We can't fight that," he whispered. "No," Saria said, "but we may not need to." Elijah stared at her. "What do you mean?" Saria inhaled deeply, gathering herself. "It follows us because it believes we still need protection, but it doesn't understand the danger has passed. It only understands hunger, memory, and the wounds carved into the world." Naomi's voice cracked. "If we don't stop it, It will kill everyone in this valley." Martha shook her head violently. "No, no, this is madness. Spirits, creatures, giants. This is devil talk." Soraya's expression hardened. "Call it devil if you wish, but it is real." A sudden thump thundered against the front wall, making the whole cabin shudder. Martha screamed. "Elijah!" Naomi cried. The creature exhaled again, long, guttural, wet. Something slimy slid across the outer boards. Soraya stood, and for the first time since she'd entered Elijah's life, she seemed afraid. "Elijah," she said quietly, "if it breaks through, you must let us go." Elijah blinked. "What?" "We have to face it," Soraya said. "Alone." "No," Elijah growled. "You're not going out there." "You don't understand," Naomi whispered. "It will never stop. Not while we breathe." Another blow struck the wall, harder this time, and one of the wooden planks split. Martha shrieked and ducked. Elijah moved to brace the wall with his shoulder. Soraya grabbed him, her strength like steel bands. "Elijah, listen to me. It won't touch you, or Martha. It only wants us." "Why?" he snapped. Soraya's gaze softened. "Because we are the ones who begged for help, and we are the ones who must answer for what came." "But it's killing people." "For us," she said bitterly. "Because it thinks that's what we need." Elijah's throat tightened. "I won't hand you to it." Naomi stepped forward then, gently touching Elijah's arm. "You showed us kindness when no one else would. We won't let your home become our grave." The wall shuddered again, and this time, something cracked open. A long black limb, slick, glistening, slid between the broken boards. Not tentacle, not arm. Something in between, something with too many joints, bending the wrong way, reaching. Martha screamed again, and fled to the corner. Elijah raised his rifle and fired. The sound exploded through the cabin. The limb jerked back, thrashing. A deep, rumbling howl echoed outside. Angry, wounded, inhuman. Naomi clutched her chest, crying out as if she felt the pain herself. "It's tied to us," she wailed. "When you hurt it, you hurt me." Elijah's stomach dropped. Soraya grabbed her sister before she collapsed. The creature outside roared again, louder, furious. It slammed its weight into the side of the cabin, causing the entire structure to tilt. "Elijah!" Martha cried. "The house won't hold." Soraya made her decision then. She stood, massive, resolute, trembling only slightly. "This ends tonight," she whispered. Naomi shook her head frantically. "Soraya, no. Yes," Soraya said. "It ends." She turned to Elijah, eyes shining with something like sorrow. "You helped us. You sheltered us. For that, you may live." "May live?" Elijah echoed. Soraya touched the door. "It won't kill you if it sees you're not with us." "Then stay," he said. "Stay with us." Soraya shook her head. "We can't." The creature let out a deafening roar, shaking dust from the rafters. Naomi sobbed, clutching her sister. Soraya leaned down and kissed Naomi's forehead. "Stay behind me," she whispered. Naomi nodded through tears. "Elijah," Soraya said, voice heavy with finality. "When the moment comes, bar the door, no matter what you hear." Elijah's mouth opened, but no words came. Soraya pulled the door latch. Naomi whispered something to her sister, too soft to hear, too full of grief to mistake. Then Soraya threw the door wide. Cold night wind howled into the cabin, and something enormous leaned forward from the shadows. The night outside swallowed Soraya instantly, her enormous silhouette framed for only a heartbeat in the doorway before the darkness closed around her. Naomi stepped out after her, smaller only in comparison. gripping her sister's hand as though letting go would mean being swept into some unseen current. Elijah lunged toward the open door. "Wait!" Saraya turned back, eyes blazing with a fierce, haunting resolve. "Close it," she commanded. Her voice carried no tremor, no doubt, only finality. Elijah froze, not from obedience, but from the sound that followed her words. A wet, slithering drag. A pulse in the earth like a heartbeat buried under soil. Then a low groan, deep, ancient, somehow mournful. Naomi stiffened. "It's right in front of us." Saraya stepped down from the porch, bare feet sinking into the soft mud. Naomi followed but kept half a step behind, trembling violently. Elijah watched, breath trapped in his throat, as the shapes of the sisters merged with the darkness. Only the lantern's weak glow illuminated them in flickers, two towering forms standing firm as something colossal shifted among the trees. Slam! The creature's bulk struck the earth again, shaking the cabin walls. Martha cried out behind Elijah, "Close the door, you fool! Close it!" But Elijah couldn't. Not yet. Outside, shadows twisted around something immense, larger than any ox, taller than a mule shed, with limbs that glistened as though wet with river muck. It had no clear shape, only motion, only the sense of vastness, like trying to glimpse the bottom of a flooded ravine at night. Saraya took another step forward. "Spirit," she called, voice steady with impossible courage. "We are here." The creature stilled. Even the wind stilled. Naomi's breath hitched. "It knows your voice." Saraya lifted her chin. "We called you once, in fear, in desperation, but we do not call you now." A ripple passed through the darkness, an undulation of matter, like water trying to lift itself into the shape of a body. Something long and glistening extended toward Saraya, slowly, almost reverently. Naomi whimpered, "Saraya." "Stand behind me," Saraya murmured without looking back. Elijah gripped the door frame so tightly, his knuckles went white. The limb, or tentacle, or arm, hovered inches from Saraya's face. A viscous droplet fell from its tip and splashed onto the earth, hissing softly as though burning. Naomi gasped and staggered. Saraya caught her. "It mirrors our pain," she whispered. "Anything it feels, I feel." The creature leaned closer, and for the first time, Elijah glimpsed something like a face. Not a human face, not any earthly creature's face, but a surface. A shifting, semi-transparent veil of fluid that reflected faint moonlight like a distorted mirror. Behind the surface, something swam. Eyes, souls, memories. Saraya stretched out her palm. "Spirit of the drowned," she said softly. "You came to our cry, but our suffering is not your burden." The creature shuddered, its entire form vibrating like a struck drum. Naomi clamped a hand over her ears and screamed, "Saraya, it's angry!" "I know," Saraya whispered. The creature's limb coiled, tightening, then recoiled violently as if struck. A sound like 1,000 whispers poured from the trees, sorrow, rage, fear, longing, all woven together. Saraya steadied herself. "We are not yours. We walk on land. You belong to the deep." The creature's limb struck the ground, hard enough to shake leaves from trees. Elijah shouted, "Get back inside!" But Saraya didn't retreat. Naomi's eyes widened, an agonized cry ripping from her throat. She swayed, nearly collapsing again. "Saraya, it's pulling at me," she gasped. "It wants me to come with it. It thinks we're going back to the river." Saraya roared, not at Naomi, not at Elijah, but at the creature. "We are not going back." And the entire forest seemed to recoil. The creature's limbs snapped backward, writhing as though wounded. A massive shadow loomed, rising to its full towering height. At least 12 feet, maybe more, its shape shifting like smoke trapped underwater. Naomi fell to her knees, clutching her head, sobbing uncontrollably. "Make it stop! Saraya, make it stop!" Saraya lowered herself beside her sister, arms wrapping around her protectively. "Listen to me," she whispered fiercely. "You have done enough. You saved us once, but your fight is not ours. Your hunger is not ours. You don't belong in this world." The creature moaned, the sound like 1,000 drowned voices rising from the bottom of the Mississippi. Naomi choked. It doesn't know how to stop. It only knows to protect by devouring." Saraya pressed her forehead to Naomi's. "Then we must show it." She stood again, slowly, painfully, every movement deliberate. She stepped forward, 1 step, 2, until she was inches from the shifting mass of the spirit. Then she did something none of them expected. She opened her arms and bowed, a gesture of surrender, of gratitude, of closure. Naomi sobbed. "Saraya, don't," Elijah whispered. "God help us." The creature leaned down, massive, fluid, terrible, until its dripping surface hovered above Saraya's bowed head. A bead of liquid fell onto her shoulder. Saraya winced, but did not move. The spirit shuddered again, the vibrations rattling the earth. Then slowly, carefully, it touched her. Not to harm, to understand. Its limb brushed her shoulder like a river touching its shore for the last time. Saraya whispered, "Your purpose is fulfilled." Naomi cried, "She's guiding it. She's sending it away." The creature let out one final moan, like a funeral song sung beneath the waves. It reared back, limbs curling inward, shape collapsing into itself like water folding into a whirlpool. Then a rush of cold wind blew through the clearing. The trees bent as if bowing. The moon flickered. And the creature dissolved. First the limbs, then the bulk, then the glow. Until nothing remained but the scent of river water and the sound of distant, dying echoes. Naomi collapsed against Saraya's chest, sobbing. "It's gone," she whispered. "It's finally gone." Saraya held her sister tightly, trembling for the first time. Inside the cabin, Martha sank to her knees, weeping. Elijah leaned against the doorframe, breathless, stunned. The night had gone utterly silent. Too silent. Elijah stepped onto the porch. "Saraya, Naomi." Saraya lifted her sister gently. "We're alive," she said. Elijah exhaled shakily. Then a new sound drifted through the forest, a distant horse's whinny, then the clatter of hooves. Martha trembled. "Elijah, who else is out there?" Elijah's face hardened. Heat lightning flashed on the horizon. More hunters, or worse, survivors?